So I suppose she's done it then. Harry and Ron paced cautiously together along the second-floor corridor, Harry's invisibility cloak aloft. The weak winter light inched apologetically through the windows and they passed the sleeping pictures in their frames, their occupants resting soundly. Harry looked Ron. It was the first time either of them had spoken since they had spotted Cecilia hurrying with her books into the castle. Then their conversation had been about discovering more of the research, and especially the nature of the mole science she had carried out when she left near Halloween, how near she was to finishing and what would happen to Harry when Snape had made the potion. Now, with the apparent mole science solved, neither young wizard could believe what they had seen take place. Looks like it. Never thought I'd see that though. Harry looked ahead this time, through the fabric of the invisibility cloak at the fuzzy surroundings before him. Mrs. Frobisher had looked exhausted, he thought. And Snape did the sensible thing when he saw that she so worn out and let her sleep. It was that simple. Only if it were that simple, why had he? "Do you think we should tell Dumbledore?" said Ron as they approached the entrance to the Gryffindor common room. "He might have done anything to her by now." "Mrs. Frobisher went to sleep, Ron," said Harry replied, looking at the portrait of the fat lady which hung across the common room entrance. "She's been working too hard and hardly resting according to Dobby. It's no wonder." "Still," continued Harry as he racked his brain to think of the password, "I can't believe what he did." They tiptoed towards the fat lady, who was sighing heavily in her sleep. Around her a group of lambs skipped merrily around one witch, their presence clearly surplus to requirements now. "I mean," he kissed her on the dash. "Shhhh," said Ron loudly as they stood in front of the picture. "I know. I saw him. But Cecilia didn't kiss him back though, did she?" Ron's was tinged with bitterness. "Look, we'd better get back before we're missed." Harry glanced at Ron as they stood underneath the invisibility cloak. Ron took a step forward. "Look," said Harry, holding Ron's arm. "You don't really think of her like that, do you? I mean, I know you like her. She's nice, in a mole-teacher kind of way, but dash. What would you know? Let's just get back to bed, shall we?" Ron turned towards the picture of the fat lady. "Sinister Canis." "Who is that?" The fat lady, in her Victorian dressing gown, sat on the edge of her four-poster bed peering out at the interruption. "Sinister Canis," said Ron, annoyed. He pulled off the invisibility cloak, throwing it at Harry. "Open up, you stupid old thing. We need to get inside." "Shhhh," hissed Harry, jumping forward next to Ron. "Sorry," he whispered apologetically to the portrait, who was about to chide Ron loudly for his rude exclamation. "I should think so too," replied the fat lady, scoldingly. "I think your friend's manners leave a lot to be desired." The picture creaked to one side and Ron stalked through, leaving Harry trailing behind as he glanced back to the fat lady, noticing from the 60-degree angle from which he was viewing the picture that she had returned to the four-poster bed. "Hey, what have we here? Night prowlers?" Harry turned his head quickly and noticed that Fred and George were sitting on one of the common room settees, and had apparently popped up from the back of it as Ron had passed. "Yes, Fred. Very funny," said Ron, trying to get past his brother. "We're Slytherin students, first years, who got lost on the way back from the dungeons and realize we're in the wrong place because this common room looks so cheerful." Harry took a few more steps towards Ron, smiling wanly to himself at his friend's sarcastic comment. "Well, we'd better see you right then, Slytherin students," laughed George, stepping to his right to stop Ron getting by. "Either you tell us where you've been, or we'll take you straight to your head of house so you can explain yourself." "You'd take me to the McGonagall?" said Ron furiously. "Like you've never left the dorm at night. In fact, I think it'd be easier to count on one hand how many times you've stopped put ever since you've been here." He flopped angrily. but defeated onto a floral settee on which Fred and George had hidden and jumped out on him from a few moments ago. "Take it easy, Ron," said Harry, concerned at the display of temper from Ron. "I'm sure the twins were only joking," he added, looking urgently at Fred and George. They nodded in agreement. "Anyway, we were talking about Snape," said Fred, jumping on the settee next to Ron and putting one hand on the back of his golden head casually. "Seeing as you said you were from Slytherin," he continued, looking at George as Ron shot him a look. "Well, you just might as well not bother. He's got company at the moment," said Ron, bitterly, before looking at Harry. Harry nodded sympathetically. "Oh yes? A woman, eh?" winked George. "Let me guess, Mrs. Frobisher's finally given in to his charms?" Ron glared at Harry before looking back at George, saying nothing. "What?" said George, looking at Fred. Fred's eyes widened in realization. "No," said Fred in horror. "Surely not," said George as the thought transferred osmotically between the twins. "We thought she had better taste than that. You are joking?" "No," said Harry, quickly, sitting on the arm of the chair and glancing between the twins. "She went to his room." He looked at Ron, to tell him she'd solved the research. "You know that," Harry said, turning to Ron. Ron folded his arms and harumphed in sarcastic agreement. "If you say so, Harry," he added. "Well, you were there with me, Ron. And you saw her pass out in Snape's arms." "No," said Harry. "She didn't. He kissed her when she was asleep. That's what we saw." He tapped Ron reassuringly in the shoulder. Ron pulled away sharply. "So," said Fred, nudging George, who had joined him on the settee. "Is that it? Little Ronnykins is jealous." He patted his brother on the shoulder, but Ron pulled away, folding his arms still further. "Hang on, she went to sleep," said George, interrupting Ron quickly and looking at Harry in confirmation. "And he kissed her?" Harry nodded. The twins exchanged glances before looking at their younger brother. "I wouldn't worry," said Fred, tapping Ron comfortingly on the shoulder. "I expect that's the only way he can get a woman in any case, waiting till she passes out." "So she's done the research then?" said George, shuffling up on the settee and allowing Fred more room and at the same time squashing Ron against the other arm. "That's great news, isn't it?" finished Fred. Harry said nothing, but shrugged and threw his invisibility cloak onto the settee opposite, sitting down heavily next to it. "No," said Ron darkly. "I bet you'll be happy when she's gone. Or at least Sirius will. I expect you'll be owl-mailing him as soon as you can, Harry? Seeing as Dobby has warned us that outgoing Flume messages are duplicated to the McGonagalls, great. I suppose if she's with Snape then Sirius can't harm her again." The twins looked at one another as Harry got to his feet quickly and, looking sharply at Ron, made towards the stairs to the boys' dormitory. "Where are you going?" muttered Ron, not looking at Harry but staring at the fireplace where the flames danced merrily in the hearth. "Bed. Then you can calm down and talk sensibly." He gathered up his invisibility cloak from where he had thrown in a few minutes ago. "And maybe apologize for what you just said. And for taking this. You know how special it is, because it was Dad's." Harry shook the cloak in his direction. Ron glared at him. "What? You think I'd borrow your invisibility cloak?" He glanced at the bundle of fabric in his friend's hand and shook his head in disbelief. "And if you think I'm apologizing, you can stop," catching a look that passed between the twins. "What?" said Harry, stepping back down the stairs. "Yes, what?" said Ron, looking at Fred. He looked back at George before both of them swiveled their heads and looked at the returning Harry. Said Fred, glancing at Ron, who had got to his feet and had stood next to Harry. He folded his arms accusingly. "You were at Quidditch practicing, Both of you," said George. And George nudged Fred now, who was on his feet. We did it to help Cecilia Dash. Mrs. Frobisher, that is Dash. She needed to get to the Slytherin dorms, to Draco's room, when he took something of hers. The night after she was broken into. George looked between Harry and Ron, pleading their indiscretion. She was going to walk right in there on her own. Bold as brass, Fred continued as Ron, now standing next to his friend in support, folded his arms. If we hadn't come up with a safer way, then she probably wouldn't be here now. She wouldn't have the mole wizard science. She did that? Harry sat down on the sofa again. She never said. He shook his head in disbelief. But I can't believe you took this. He gripped the cloak tighter as he spoke. How many times have you taken it without you asking? So would you have let us if we'd asked? Harry glared at Fred, who shrugged at George confused. She's so brave, said Ron, looking at his brothers. Even we've never been to the Slytherin dorm. Look what she's done for you, Harry. He turned to look Harry, raising his voice. And all you can do is accuse me of betraying you? What's the matter anyway? You didn't used to be so protective. I didn't used to have the prospect of losing my powers hanging over my head either, snapped Harry, sinking back into the sofa. His voice was hollow, resonating his hitherto unuttered feelings. Before they had merely been vague clouds of unease, lingering at the back of his subconscious, but now, they had consolidated into fear. Harry slumped forward, holding his head between his invisibility cloak in his hands. Ron squeezed himself between Harry and the arm of the other sofa and patted his back, half expecting Harry to pull away. But Harry just held his face against the cloak until he had regained composure. We can just go and tell Dumbledore you won't do it, said Ron, comfortingly. You can say you've thought about it, and you think it's too dangerous. He looked across at the twins, who nodded slowly. Fred walked across and sat on the arm next to Harry. It's not like he can force you. You've done enough to fight Voldemort as it is. Harry shook his head, and looked at Ron, his eyes red from bitter, strong tears. And say what? Can you also say sorry to the Order for risking their lives every day to stop the Death Eaters from damaging the Ministry? And can you also apologize to all the moles who will die in the future because Voldemort is about? And say sorry to Mr. Diggory for Cedric's death and to all the other fathers like him in the future who lose sons? Oh, and not forgetting to say sorry to Mrs. Frobisher for coming all this way and doing so much, nearly getting murdered on 3 occasions and solving the mole science. Because I'm afraid I can't take the potion because I might not get my powers back. That's going to go down really well, isn't it? She solved the mole science. The voice came from behind them and the boys turned to see Hermione, dressed with her work ready to visit the library, coming down the stairs. Oh, how marvelous! She paced quickly across to Harry and Ron, George stepping aside to let her pass. She looked at Harry as she sat next to George on the sofa, looking intently at Harry. You're up at 5:15 to go to the library? Asked George, incredulously. What did she do then? Hermione continued, ignoring George. What was the link? I can't wait to speak to her about it. She promised me, you know, she promised all of us, didn't she, Ron, that she'd tell us about it once she'd done it. You know, I might just forget about the library and go and find her now. Hermione stopped when she saw the expressions of glumness on Harry and Ron's faces. What's the matter? She asked, looking between Harry and Ron. What's happened? They looked between one another, saying nothing. Look, said George, turning to Hermione just as she was about to ask them again. Harry and Ron sneaked down too. Actually, what had you gone to find out about? He asked, realizing they had not given a reason for actually sneaking out that night. Well, anyway, they followed Mrs. Frobisher and she went to Snape's room. And they heard her explain the connection between mole science and wizard magic. So in short, she's figured it out. That's what's upsetting Harry. He's scared about his imminent loss of powers, and how the effects could be permanent with the potion Snape's going to make. And after she told him, Mrs. Frobisher passed out, and Snape tucked her up into his bed and kissed her when she was out of it. That's what's upsetting Ron. Both boys glared at George, as he succinctly outlined their problems to Hermione. She looked between them. "Oh," she said, shaking her head. "Gosh, I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of it, the both of you." Hermione stared at them both. "Right, okay," she said, looking at both Harry and Ron. "Aside from the fact you were spying on her, Ron, from what George has just said, Cecilia has just made the biggest discovery for both the Mile and Wizard worlds. It's mind-blowingly big. Wouldn't you want to share it with your work colleague, especially if you had no one else to talk to about it that would understand?" He was probably very pleased that she had done it. Now he can make the potion. I mean, it can't be fun being a spy for Dumbledore and still have to go and associate with Death Eaters, can it? "I thought you hated Snape," said Harry, quietly. "I still think there's more to this than professional appreciation, Hermione. You weren't there. You didn't see how he kissed her," he added quickly to stop her interrupting. "It was. I do think you're making a big deal of this. And Harry, don't you think that Cecilia and Snape are going to make it as safe for you as they possibly can? They aren't just going to feed you the first one they make, are they? I know Mrs. Frobisher wouldn't. I really wish you'd both think reasonably, before jumping to conclusions." She tutted as Ron and Harry glanced at one another, and she got to her feet. "Anyone else want to join me in the library? The grimoires will have been returned by now, so I'll get all the information I need from them today." "Okay, fine," she said, getting to her feet. "See you later." "Bye," they chorused, as she left them. "Well, I still think there's more to this than meets the eye," said Harry to Ron and the twins. "And I'm going to tell Sirius." "Why? What does he need to know for?" "Do you tell him everything she does?" Harry looked down as Ron spoke, thinking about the letter that Sirius had sent asking Harry to tell him everything. And he had. But Ron was right, and so was Hermione. Did he have to know about this? Surely the most important thing was the research. "Surely the most important thing is the research," continued Ron, echoing Harry's own thoughts. "Perhaps Hermione's right and there was nothing in it," he added, hopefully. "And they'll have to make sure it's safe, Harry," said Fred, tapping Harry on the back. "How do you feel about defeating Voldemort?" Harry shrugged, and looked at Fred. "I don't know. Afraid? Relieved, too. I mean, what if my powers don't come back? I will have defeated the greatest evil the world has ever known, but I won't have my powers. I'll be even less like my parents. Much further away from them than before. I'll do it, though," he added, looking at Ron. "I'll have to. Imagine having the opportunity to rid the world of Voldemort and not take it. I'm afraid, but I'll do it." "Way hey!" cheered George, jumping up from the settee. Spoken like a true Gryffindor. 3 cheers for Harry. Hip hip. "Hooray," finished Fred. Hip hip. "Hooray," cheered Ron, grinning at Harry. Hip hip. "Hooray," they all cheered, and grinned to one another. "Thanks guys," said Harry, getting to his feet. "Now I think it's time for some sleep. Coming, Ron?" 5 minutes later, leaving the twins in the common room, they crept into their own beds. Amidst the snoring of their fellow Gryffindors, Harry thought about all that had gone on. "Are you going to the Christmas ball?" he whispered across to Ron. Said Ron, sleepily. "Is there going to be one? A ball like the Yule Ball last year?" Whispered Harry, though not exactly the same. "No Xpitons or Durmstrang. Just us. I'm not going through all that again, not having to ask people. Perhaps I'll ask." He yawned, and turned over in the direction of Harry. "I asked Hermione," said Harry, "but she said she wasn't going to go. So I asked Ginny instead, she said yes. You're not upset, are you?" "Nah," said Ron. "Hermione's just a friend, Harry. And anyway, Mrs. Frobisher did say men think differently to women. I bet Hermione's been obsessing about the whole thing since last year." "When did she say that?" asked Harry quickly. He hadn't recalled Ron mentioning this before. "Oh, last week, just after she gave us the work to look through for her. I went to find Angelina about the Quidditch final and met her coming out of the Great Hall. She said I should look deep down and see what my heart was truly telling me." "I don't think you should ask Mrs. Frobisher, Ron." Harry swallowed, wondering why she would give Ron such strange advice. "I know how much you like her, but she'll tell you it's not appropriate." Like the last time, before he could say anything else however, the warm feeling of sleep washed over Harry's head and he yawned. "But she won't be our teacher anymore, and the more I think about it the more I'm sure Hermione was right about tonight," added Ron, a little too loudly. Seamus Finnegan in the bed next to him turned over and opened his eyes in the pale morning light. "Anyway, you asked Ginny?" "Thanks," he continued, changing the subject as he shuffled to a more comfortable spot. "She said Neville was all hands last year, even though he was a very good dancer. I would have worried if it had been anyone else, Harry. At least you can look after her." Harry nodded to himself as he drifted off to sleep. Should he break it to him? He pictured Ginny in his mind's eye, no longer the child he had first met at King's Cross Station 5 years ago. Sooner or later Ron would have to get used to the fact that his little sister was growing up. 88,888,888. "You are to be highly commended, Mrs. Frobisher, for the work you have done." Dumbledore warmly, ushering Cecilia to sit on one of the chairs he magicked into existence before them. "Hear, hear," said former headmistress Styles from her frame. "We are all overjoyed at your success, my dear," she added, looking around the pictures of the former heads of Hogwarts who were listening intently at the conversation before them. "Are we?" asked Phineas Nigellus, doubtfully. "Yes, we are," replied Dippet, loudly at the black antecedent and most unpopular headmaster of all time. "Because Albus is overjoyed at her success." "Indeed," said Dumbledore, confirming his predecessor's sentiments. "We have the making of the new weapon now, and it is entirely down to your perseverance and skill." "Our Professor," said Cecilia quickly, looking at Snape. He had not sat on Dumbledore's request, but stood by the side of Cecilia's chair, looking stern. "Both Severus and I have done this." Dumbledore looked from Cecilia to Snape. He didn't move as she spoke, but stood immobile, listening to the conversation between them. "Yes, of course. Now, you may be able to get on with the work." He addressed Snape, who nodded stiffly. "I have checked the science, Headmaster. We do indeed have the correct information." He held out a sheaf of parchment, neatly bound. "I took the liberty, Mrs. Frobisher, of reproducing the notes that you made, and also adding a version that could be more easily understood by wizards. For your information, Headmaster." He handed the work to Dumbledore. Cecilia watched him carefully. It had been a strange morning, and that was no doubt. The last thing she had remembered was waking up in bed, thinking about the dream she had had. It felt so real, and she had almost jumped out and hurried downstairs to her kitchen in search of Tim, her Tim, who had been in the kitchen, making bacon and eggs. Who was, inexplicably, home again, and they were back together. Only she wasn't as home now. She was at Hogwarts. And what she had believed to be real, was indeed a dream. She had lain back down and her heart sank. There was no Tim and Cecilia again, as her subconscious had told her. There was only her. So why had she felt so light, carefree, like something was off her shoulders? Then she looked around and realized something was not quite right. The desk, for example. It didn't have her things piled up on top of it. Her clothing, which Dobby dutifully and insistently washed for her, were not on her chair. The room itself was much darker than her own. "That is most diligent, Severus. How long will it be now until you can perfect the potion? You understand we need it as soon as possible." Cecilia looked across at Snape, as he looked at Dumbledore, who had looked up reading the manuscript containing their work. It had taken her a while to work out where she was that morning, and then, all at once, she remembered going to speak to Severus the previous night. About the research. About moles and wizards. Of course. Energy had been the connection. "And you have information regarding the wizard Lully," continued Dumbledore. He looked across at Cecilia, who had begun to daydream and was staring at the portrait of Godric Gryffindor, 1097 to 1123, which hung above Dumbledore's office fireplace. She nodded, looking back at him. "If you notice here," she said, getting up from her chair and pointing to the relevant page in the research notes, "it would seem that Lully was a wizard who worked with mole scientists almost 80 years ago. Not only scientists, but the best scientists of the age." Dumbledore looked at her in astonishment. "This is indeed remarkable. Raymond Lully was indeed a wizard of high standing. He was a member of the Ministry for many years. Are you sure of his involvement?" he asked, peering over his half-moon spectacles. "Yes," she nodded happily. "From the evidence I have from the mole scientists themselves." Cecilia stopped and exhaled, to stop herself getting too worked up with the excitement of her discovery. "I believe, Professor," she continued, "that if Raymond Lully had completed all the work he was undertaking, with the physicists at the turn of the century, and with the geneticists, and medicine, where Pompox Pomfrey was involved, he would have come to the same conclusion as we have." She looked at Snape, who was giving her the same look as he had done when he had re-entered his room when she got up, asking whether she had slept well. Cecilia had nodded, in confirmation, feeling slightly self-conscious at sitting on the edge of Snape's bed with the satin covers around her shoulders. "It does not affect the science-magic connection. The information we have is enough." "But," she paused. Dumbledore looked at her again. "I am convinced there is more to it than that," Cecilia conceded, running her mind over again the pieces of information that had not yet fitted into the jigsaw puzzle, the title page of Mysterious Mythology giving her the link. "And Joseph Black. In fact, I'm sure of it. It just seems so much of a coincidence that he studied all of this. There's surely more to this than what I've presented to you." Dumbledore nodded. "I agree, Mrs. Frobisher. And were this not a time of war, I would declare this work of supreme importance to our worlds. It is indeed of significant interest to both moles and wizards, and shows we are more closely related than others believe us to be." Snape shifted from foot to foot. "So it must suffice that the only wizards to be informed are those of the Order of the Phoenix, and Harry too, should he be interested. You have proved yourself an honorable member of the Order, Cecilia." Dumbledore placed the manuscript on his desk, and sat down in his large oak chair, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "We will need time to refine the connection, Headmaster," said Snape, looking from Cecilia to Dumbledore. Cecilia looked at him in astonishment. At long last he was voicing her opinions, rather than reinterpreting her sentiments. He was supporting her and agreeing with her before Dumbledore, which he had never done before. Cecilia had said the very same thing to Snape that morning, as she collected her things together from his desk, before thanking him for his hospitality that night. And now, standing before Dumbledore, the most powerful wizard in the world, describing their success, the thought struck her now that they were at ease in each other's company. "We also need," began Cecilia, but Snape shook his head. "I took the liberty, Cecilia, of compiling a full inventory of my private stores and your chemicals. believe we have more than enough of everything." He handed her a list, written in green ink, and Cecilia scanned it. He was right, there was everything they could possibly need, from innocuous plant materials to concentrated acids and venoms. "In that case, we should continue now, today," she said, handing the list back to Snape. "It is Sunday after all, and if we can get the preliminary work done, you'll be in a position to continue the work when I've returned home." Cecilia had been nursing this thought at the back of her mind for several days now, telling herself, reminding herself to keep going, then she could be back home for Christmas. She could see Libby and Freya. She would be able to go to church and hear the Salvation Army carols on Christmas Eve. She could walk amongst the shops and marvel at the glittery clothes and woolens that were for sale. And now the connection was made. She could put the dangerous world of wizards behind her and get on with her life. Began Snape, but stopped as Dumbledore as he got to his feet. "Your sentiments are noble, and your dedication to your work, as I have said, are remarkable." He nodded at her in acknowledgement. "However, there will be plenty of time to complete the work, Cecilia. I wish you to consider taking the remainder of the day to rest. This evening will be time enough to speak of your triumph, for a triumph it is." He got to his feet and walked over to Cecilia, patting her on the back. "I trust you rested well enough last night?" Cecilia nodded dumbly. What did he mean? This time enough this evening? "There is another meeting this evening," Dumbledore continued, as if reading her mind. "As a member Cecilia, and principal researcher in this matter, I can think of no one better suited to address the Order on the work." Cecilia looked at him sharply. "You want me to return to Grimmauld Place? And speak to the Order?" Her mind began to race with thoughts, and Dumbledore put a friendly arm around her shoulders. "Of course," he said warmly. "Your work is unprecedented. Even Raymond Lully was unable to make the connection, or at least as detailed and practical as yourself." Cecilia looked at Snape. He had not moved since Dumbledore had mentioned the Order meeting. Now he turned, and nodded towards Cecilia. "But," she began, taking a step towards him. "Severus, you are duty-bound to share this information with the Order," Snape concurred, turning to Cecilia. "And for many of those present you will feed them information that will force them to reconsider their views of Muggles. If you wish to work this afternoon, we may. But you should take a few hours off, at least." He smiled a little at her, and Cecilia nodded. At least she would be able to attend the Order meeting with him, and she wouldn't have to stand before 30 wizards alone. "All right," Cecilia said, defeated. "I'll be at the potions classroom at 3. Snape nodded in agreement. "And once I've done all of this," she thought to herself, "and passed the work on, I can think about going home." 88,888,888. Have you considered how this will impact on all of your potions? Cecilia pointed to the equation they had before them: energy, light and magic. It was 6 o'clock in the evening, and Cecilia and Snape were in the middle of a heated debate about the status of future potions teaching at Hogwarts. "It's going to, when you teach. Now we understand about energy," she persisted. Snape glared at her momentarily before striding over to the bookshelf and retrieving a battered volume of the Standard Book of Spells, Volume 2, Potion Making. "Not in the least. I will not be teaching wizards about energy," he intoned. "This is what they learn. By using the calorimeter you'll be able to cut down on research time, and allow students to come to their own conclusion about the most effective ingredients, without them needlessly wasting batches which are of the wrong consistency." "I will indeed use that method for our research, Cecilia," he said, looking at the instrument carefully. "What I suggest is if we analyze the potions we do have, that will have the most effect. It will shortcut our work by many months," he agreed. Cecilia sat on the edge of the bench and rested her feet on the bench, looking at the array of potions she had watched Snape prepare that afternoon. They now had a better idea of the efficacy of the potion, and they had agreed that it would probably be necessary for it to be in 2 stages, one to inhibit the endocrine action, so as to disable Voldemort in some way. The other to counteract its effect at a predetermined time, an antidote to the disabling effects of the first potion on Harry. We still need to consider the effect on the endocrine system so we can determine quantities, he said, writing it down in their new notebook. I think we should work on that first, before we begin on Dash. Just then, the door creaked open and Snape turned in its direction. He scowled, and Cecilia turned to see Hermione standing in the doorway. "Excuse me, Mrs. Frobisher," said Hermione quickly. "I was just wondering whether you had time to—" She took a couple of steps towards Cecilia, but stopped as Snape approached her malevolently. "How dare you interrupt, Miss Granger?" he growled icily. "Mrs. Frobisher and I are engaged in a professional conversation. 5 points will be deducted from Gryffindor House for your impertinence and boldness." She looked at Snape, then back at Cecilia. Cecilia got to her feet. "I would be grateful, Hermione, if your query is to do with schoolwork, that I speak to you tomorrow during your lesson. At the moment I am currently engaged with Professor Snape in other matters." Hermione looked between Cecilia and Snape, nodding in comprehension. "May I speak to you afterwards, then? During break? It's just—" She stopped, realizing Snape was still staring at her. Cecilia realized it too. "Of course. Enjoy your evening, Hermione," she said, urging the young witch to leave them. "I appreciate your conscientious attitude to your work," she added, hoping the veiled gratitude would not pass unnoticed. Hermione nodded. "Of course," she said, and with a quick glance at Snape, departed hurriedly. "What was all that about?" said Snape, when Hermione had shut the door. Cecilia sat herself back on the table, and looked back at him. "Anything I should know about?" "Not really," said Cecilia, lightly. "Unless you're interested in the heartache of a young witch in love," she added. "Spare me," said Snape scornfully, looking at the 3 hours' work laid out before them on the table. "Now, the potion you saw me brew third, that can be made in 2 stages. So it is certain that we could reverse the second stage. It matches the ultraviolet frequency you tested in the summer, so it is more than suitable in that respect." He put down the vial of green, clear liquid. "If it could be done then, we would have the template liquor," they said in unison. Cecilia and Snape looked at one another. "I feel, Mrs. Frobisher, that we may be finished this work sooner than we expect. The flobber worm breeding has gone to plan, and so therefore we will be able to experiment on the cellular effects and, what is it now?" he boomed, as the door creaked open again. "I do beg your pardon, Headmaster," he added, in much more staid tones as Dumbledore entered the classroom. He lowered his wand, which he had automatically pulled out in response to the interruption. Cecilia jumped off the table again. "Do excuse us for the interruption," began Dumbledore, as Harry followed him inside the classroom. "May I speak with you, Professor Snape?" Snape glared at Harry, who had sat himself on one of the chairs at the back of the classroom and was eyeing the potions that were laid out on the desk by Cecilia. "Alone? It will only take a couple of minutes." Snape nodded, and shot Harry a withering stare, before looking in the direction of the room at the back of the potions classroom. "My office, Headmaster, will that suffice?" "Indeed," said Dumbledore graciously. He followed Snape up the stone steps and through the arched doorway without looking back. Cecilia watched Dumbledore close the door, wondering vaguely what it was about. "Mrs. Frobisher?" Cecilia turned and saw Harry next to her, looking at the potions on the table beside her. "Mrs. Frobisher, I was wondering. I spoke to Dumbledore and he told me you had made the connection between moles and wizards." He looked earnestly at her as he spoke, and Cecilia smiled and nodded. "Indeed, she replied. And I must thank you, Harry. If you had not undertaken the research of scientists, I would not have done so as soon. Would you like me to explain the connection? Harry looked at her quickly, then nodded. Okay then, sit down. 10 minutes later and Harry appeared more confused than ever, but he seemed to be happy with the explanation she'd given. So you see, Harry, your question about light was not stupid. It acts as a particle and a wave. I said it was an advanced question because it means the person needs to be prepared for the answer to be complex. More than two things are happening at the same time, you see. It's neither one nor the other exclusively, and as such we get the answer of energy. Harry nodded. Energy, like you said to Hermione and Ron, a few months ago. That's the link? So you knew all along, deep down? Cecilia nodded. I had a suspicion. But with science it has to be provable. You must be able to demonstrate it many times over to ensure you have the correct link. But not only that, Raymond Lully almost found it. And if he hadn't been killed in the Goblin riots, it may have come to light in the wizard world long before now. That's great, said Harry, smiling. So you're getting on with making the potion with Snape. Cecilia frowned. Professor Snape, Harry, she chided. And yes, we seem to have made some progress, even today. It's difficult to understand parts of it, continued Harry. It seems like a lot of things going on at once. He looked down away from Cecilia, with an expression of trepidation, as his long walk to his execution was stayed during the whole time she was searching. You've put in a lot of work, Mrs. Frobisher, he added quietly. And how do you feel about it, Harry? Asked Cecilia, sitting at a bench. The fire in the hearth of the Mole Studies classroom flickered and crackled. I have to ask, the wizards who claim to care about your well-being seem to think it is in your best interests not to know. Okay, he said, getting to his feet. I just think there's a long road ahead of me now. I do feel afraid. He stopped speaking, and looked into the fire. It's what I have to do. I'm the only one that can do it. Anyway, here, he said, handing Cecilia back her own encyclopedia. I've done the essay now. Cecilia shook her head. You keep it, Harry, she said. I can get another when I return home. And besides, whoever your new Mole Studies teacher is will be impressed with your knowledge of scientists. No doubt about that. She stopped and picked up the book, flicking through it to L, not registering the look Harry gave her. I've only worked out the link between moles and wizards, she continued, scanning the pages. It's not solved yet. I still don't know who Raymond Lully was, only what his connection is here. He's related to Sirius. Did I tell you? She looked up and was startled by Harry's intense stare. I would love to know what he has to do with all of this. You're leaving, Cecilia? Mrs. Frobisher, I mean? You won't be teaching us anymore? Cecilia shook her head, and got to her feet, reaching for her cardigan that was on the back of a chair and putting it on. She nodded. But, I thought you were going to stay to help Professor Snape. I mean, he looked away and flopped onto a chair. If it's just Professor Snape with the potion, and I have to take it. I mean. He stopped. Cecilia gave him a pitying look. I'll be here until the end of term. Then I will be returning home. By then, Professor Snape will have all information for the correct potion. She realized that Dumbledore and Snape were returning to the classroom. But, insisted Harry loudly as they crossed the flagstones and rejoined Harry and Cecilia, Snape and Harry exchanging a look of mutual mistrust. Is it going to be dangerous? He continued. Cecilia was about to answer when Dumbledore raised a hand. Harry, I will not lie to you. Dumbledore stood amongst them and spoke slowly and patiently to the young wizard. The work is very risky. I have just discussed the magical aspect of the potion that will be made. There is a strong possibility that once you take the first potion that inhibits your ability to perform magic, the second one will not reverse the effects. Now, Professor Snape has assured me that the correct procedure for a novel potion will be carried out as regards safety. But you need to be aware, Harry, that the risk you take with the new weapon is real, and adverse effects may befall you. Silence reigned for what seemed like an eternity. Harry looked at Snape, and then back at Dumbledore. Eventually he nodded. "I know," he said, looking at Dumbledore intently. "I've always known it would be dangerous. But if I don't take the potion, and we don't take the chance. I don't think I could live with the fact that I could have done something." Dumbledore nodded slowly. Cecilia's heart grew lighter, for she was convinced that he would say he did not want to take the risk. Snape stood stock still, staring frostily at Harry. "But," he looked at Cecilia this time. "Mrs. Frobisher, can I speak to you?" Cecilia looked at Dumbledore and Snape, thrown by Harry's request to speak to her. "Do you wish to speak confidentially? Shall we step outside?" Harry nodded, and led the way. "Mrs. Frobisher," said Harry, when they were in dimly lit classroom corridor, "I wanted to ask you." "I'll still be leaving at Christmas," said Cecilia, shaking her head. Harry looked at her and shook his own. "No, that's not what I was going to ask. There's going to be a Yule Ball here on Christmas Eve. Everyone enjoyed it so much last year. Well, me and Ron didn't, but most of us did. That's why there's going to be another one. If you're still here, Ron would like to know if you'd go to it with him." "Sorry, Harry?" Cecilia blinked. What was he talking about? "What do you mean?" "There's going to be a ball. We had one last year, the Yule Ball. And we're having another this year." He stopped, as if explaining it slower was going to help. "You're still going to be here then, aren't you, Mrs. Frobisher?" Cecilia nodded. It would be the last teaching day. Her last day at Hogwarts. "Ron was going to ask you himself, but as you said you were leaving, I wanted to check, so when he asked you, and if you said no, it wasn't because you didn't want to go with him. It was because you wouldn't be here. And it wouldn't be inappropriate, as you wouldn't be our teacher anymore," he finished, looking at her earnestly. Cecilia looked at Harry in disbelief. Eventually she spoke. "Are you asking me to go, as a partner to Ron Weasley, to the Yule Ball?" Harry nodded. Cecilia shook her head, and smiled, trying not to laugh at the preposterous idea. "Please tell Ron, Harry, I am flattered by his invitation, but it would indeed be inappropriate. As of the end of Christmas Eve I would still officially be a teacher at Hogwarts, for a start. And second, I'm almost twice his age." Harry nodded. "Okay, I'll tell him," said Harry, quietly. "But just so you know, Mrs. Frobisher, you're the best Mole Studies teacher we've ever had, and I'll miss you too." "Same goes for students," said Cecilia. "But I'm not gone yet. I've still got the Quidditch friendlies to go to before then," she added. "You'll be playing, won't you, Harry?" He nodded, then looked towards the door as it creaked open. Dumbledore stepped outside. "I expect you'll be making your way to the Great Hall for supper, Harry," said Dumbledore, smiling at Harry. He nodded, smiling at Cecilia before turning and walking away. They watched him turn right and into the courtyard, Cecilia realizing for the first time she would be. "You have made an impact on the students, it seems," said Dumbledore, chuckling. Cecilia laughed. "A crush, no less, from Mr. Weasley." Cecilia laughed and looked at Dumbledore, who smiled at her again. "And you will be a much missed member of staff, speaking for myself, of course. Now, perhaps if I could ask you to step back inside, we'll flew to the meeting from there." He held open the thick oak door and gestured with his left arm for her to enter. Cecilia stepped in and approached Snape, who was reading through some papers on the bench by the potions, a cloud of trepidation growing in her mind. She'd forgotten they were going there. That Dumbledore had asked her to speak to the Order. "So, we're going to Flute to Grimmauld Place?" asked Cecilia, looking at Snape, and trying to look happy about it. "Are we going now?" "You are," replied Snape, putting down the parchment. Cecilia could see he had written up the work they had carried out that afternoon already. "I, alas, have other duties which I must attend." Cecilia looked at him in horror. Not coming? She was counting on Snape to be there when she discussed the work. And not least as a guarantee that if she stuck with him all evening she would avoid having to speak to Sirius. "Indeed," said Dumbledore. "I would be honored to present the most distinguished Order member to the rest of her associates and friends myself. A privilege no other headmasters can acclaim," he added with sincerity. "Is that not correct, Severus?" "Indeed not," he replied, glancing at Cecilia. "I believe you underestimate the significance of this, Cecilia, because of your natural aversion to praise. What you have done is so important that it defies anything that has gone before. All wizards will remember your name when the Dark Lord is defeated, and when the dark times are over." Cecilia looked back at Snape, trying to hold back the tears of emotion. She had never heard him speak like that before. He had told her the truth, which she would barely admit to herself. And coming from Severus Snape. "Won't you come with us?" she asked, trying not to sound desperate. "This is also your work, Severus. I will not let you deny it, and I believe you too have a duty to share it with the Order." Snape shook his head. "Alas, I must avail you of your benevolent side, Cecilia, that you represent my contribution when you address the Order." Snape stopped and Cecilia could see his left arm twitch uncontrollably. How long had he been ignoring it, pretending the pain would go away? "Of course," she turned to Dumbledore. "And of course I would be honored to accompany the head of the Order." She smiled and Dumbledore held out his left arm. "If you would step this way, Mrs. Frobisher, and I will escort you to the headquarters." He pulled out his wand, and waved it in the direction of the fireplace. Instantly, the orange embers were replaced with a green shimmering light. Cecilia swallowed in apprehension of the sickness she would feel very soon. "You know," said Dumbledore, as they turned to look outwards at the potions classroom, "sometimes wizards take fluing badly, too. Take my brother, for example. I remember a time, 125 years ago, when he was so ill after traveling by flu he had to spend almost a day in bed afterwards. Not a good illness to have when you work 300 miles away from home, I'm sure you'll agree." Cecilia closed her eyes briefly as Dumbledore waved his wand before them. "And our father was not very happy to hear he'd given up his place at the ministry because of it." Cecilia opened her eyes again as the image of the room turned green before them and, hearing Dumbledore's story about his brother vaguely on the edge of consciousness, she watched in horror as Snape dropped to his knees, buckling up in agony and grimacing in pain, gripped his lower arm. The image faded before her eyes, and as the sickening feeling began to rise in her stomach it took all of Cecilia's willpower not to beg Dumbledore for them to return to Hogwarts. 88,888,888. And now, nausea had been replaced by fear as she sat in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place, just under 6 months since she had taken to her feet and decried the cowardice of moles to the assembled wizards. Then, she had barely known any of them, and had spoken out, as she had seen the situation, claiming she would do what she could for them and, indirectly for moles like her. Now, at the end of her research, the answer lay before her, complicated, awkward, ill-fitting and above all, close to the bone. What she would say to these wizards would indeed make them think differently about moles, and their status. It would also make some of them dislike her. A reaction not limited to wizards, of course. But professionally she had never had to speak before a potentially semi-hostile group of people, especially when none amongst them had any experience of mole science directly. They would have to trust her word. 3 suspicious packages delivered to the ministry. Kingsley Shacklebolt swallowed, and looked at Arthur Weasley. We investigated, and discovered they belonged to 3 wizards living in a flat in the East End of London and contained their wands and hats. Cecilia gazed round the wizards, listening to the Fifth Order member give his latest installment of work from the Ministry. She wrung her hands without thinking, and her mind drifted to what she must say, any minute now. Given the new directive following the Halloween debacle, 7 new positions have been created in the Department of. She looked at Kingsley, pretending to listen, but her mind raced, trying to focus on the main points that she would deliver and the questions she might be asked, trying not to stare absent-mindedly at anyone in the packed kitchen as it rolled across her mind. What if they asked her about genes? Or science for that matter? How could she explain to these wizards about its intricacy and ability to self-correct so that what came of it was more or less entirely true? And how would she react if they dismissed it? And Arthur has made a note of it? Dumbledore's voice penetrated Cecilia's thoughts, and she looked across at Mr. Weasley, hastily taking notes. She smiled in his direction. It had been he who had greeted her first, guiding her from Dumbledore and sitting her down in the kitchen, amongst the other Order members. Mrs. Weasley had pressed a cup of tea into her hands, and told her how delighted she was to see her again. Before she had a chance to speak to anyone else, however, Dumbledore quickly called the meeting open, and began by discussing the era shifts which had, by all accounts, become muddled during November. And now, as Dumbledore directed Arthur Weasley to note the Department of Artifacts' new employees, she felt a hand on her shoulder. "No need to be so nervous," she heard Sirius whisper. Cecilia froze as she felt his warm breath on her neck. "Rumor has it you've done something particularly clever, and tonight we are going to hear about it," he added softly. She turned slightly, but stopped when she caught another face, that of Remus Lupin. Remus smiled at her gently before looking away, and to the center of the group. "Sirius," said Dumbledore, looking in her direction. "Mrs. Frobisher, are you ready to discuss your findings?" Cecilia looked back at Dumbledore, and realized that every wizard assembled was looking at her. She nodded. "Why yes," Cecilia replied quietly, her mouth dry. She cleared her throat, and swallowed, getting to her feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, stepping forward and standing next to Dumbledore. He looked at her encouragingly before retiring to a chair just behind her,